So welcome everybody to Introduction to Earthworms, which is an end-to-learn webinar, which means that it's supposed to be educational. So we're going to be looking really at an introduction to earthworm biology and ecology. We're going to have a bit of a British focus, but we will also have a look at some things a little bit further afield. And a huge thank you to the Forest of Bowland for funding this webinar and making it possible. So, just a very quick, brief mention of who I am. My name is Keiron Brown, and I'm the National Recorder for Earthworms. So that means I hold the volunteer role of Recording Officer for the Earthworm Society of Britain. Earthworm Society of Britain was founded in 2009, and over the years we've been developing a national earthworm recording scheme and providing training, guidance, and support for biological recorders, so people that go out and identify earthworms. So yeah, just a quick brief mention to them. So I thought we'd start with what is an earthworm, so make sure that we're all on the same page and that nobody's here for some other things. So I like to start by looking at the word, breaking it up, because really they do what it says on the tin. So if we look at the word earth, it can mean a number of different things. It could refer to the planet, the substance of the land surface, like the soil. It can be an electrical connection to the ground, or the underground den of a badger or fox. In this case, we're talking about the soil. And a worm, as well as describing a weak or despicable person, can refer to any number of creeping or burrowing invertebrate animals with long, slender, soft bodies and no limbs. And that's obviously what we're talking about when we look at an earthworm. And if we look at the dictionary definition of the word earthworm, it means a burrowing annelid worm that lives in the soil, that's important in aerating and draining the soil and in burying organic matter. So that's what an earthworm is. I've got a number of different worms here that are on the screen. What I'd like you to do, I'm going to give you about a minute to do this, is just write down, you don't have to put in the chat, but you can if you like. Write down which of these you think are earthworms. So there's 8 there. I'm not going to tell you how many of them are. I'll tell you at least one of them is. But how many of these, write down your numbers, either in the chat or on a scrap of paper, or if you've got a better memory than me, then in your head. Have a look and think about which one of these are earthworms. Now, they are all worms of some kind. They've all got worm in their title. I'll give you a clue. There is more than one. So I'm seeing a few numbers there. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. So people are saying 4 and 5 look quite popular. 7's been mentioned a few times. I see an 8. Okay. Right. 4, 5, 7, 8. Yeah. 6, 3. Nobody's going for 1. Nobody's going for 2. Right, all of them earthworms, right? Okay, you ready for the answers? So number 1 is not an earthworm. It is related to earthworms. It's a leech. So it's quite difficult to tell, but the big difference between leeches and earthworms are the mouth parts. We'll come to that in a minute. Number 2 is not an earthworm. This is a bristle worm. It's specifically a sand striker or bobbit worm, and it lives in the sediment in the ocean, in the sea, and it's an ambush predator. It comes out with those huge jaws and grabs fish and other things above it and drags them into the sediment where it devours them. So quite gruesome, but also related to earthworms. So when we described what an earthworm was, a dictionary definition, there was a term annelid, and I'll come to that in a second. But both 1 and 2, the leech and the bobbit worm, they are both types of annelid. So 3, yes, that is an earthworm. That's the earthworm that most people are familiar with. It's a species called Lumbricus terrestris, known in the UK as the lobworm or the common earthworm, which is a little bit misleading because it's actually not the most common. In America, they call it the night crawler, and they call it the night crawler because it comes out of the ground at night, where it will mate or gather up leaves that it will take into its burrow to eat. Number 4, very different size to that number 3. Number 3 can grow up to 40 centimeters. Number 4, much, much smaller creature, but it is an earthworm. It's just a different type. There are more than one. Number 5, yes, that is an earthworm too. You may recognize this as looking very similar to the types of earthworm that you might find in your compost bin. You may think it's a brandling worm, but I don't think that one actually is. I think it's another type of composting worm that looks superficially very similar. You need to look down a microscope to separate them out. A few people said number 6. Number 6 has a couple of features there that earthworms don't have. I can see a nose and I can see eyes. That means it's definitely not an earthworm, and it's not an annelid. That is actually a slow worm, so it's a legless lizard, and it's more closely related to us than it is to an earthworm. Number 7, yeah, another type of earthworm, but looks different yet again. I'm not sure what species that is. I think it might be Aporectidea rosea, which is called the rosy worm. And you'd find that in the top layers of the soil. Number 8 looks very much like an earthworm. It has got segments like an earthworm. It's a bit of a trick one, this one, really, because they do look very, very similar. It's a bit smaller than an earthworm, though. You will find it in the soil in your compost bin. It's what we call a potworm. So these tiny little white worms, very closely related to earthworms, also annelids. So I've mentioned this term annelid a couple of times. What does that mean? Well, when we are describing different groups of organisms, different animals or plants or fungi, we group them into different levels of, depending on how they're related. So the most closely related individuals will all belong to one species, and they'll be able to mate with each other. Similar species will be grouped in a genus, and then you have family, order, class, etc. So there's lots of different groups. So annelids is a phylum, so it's quite a big, broad group, and the annelids are the segmented worms. So any worms that have clear segmentation, those different body segments, then they will belong to Annelida. And that divides into 2 main classes. Now, everything I'm going to teach you today is a bit simplified, because obviously the taxonomy, it's never as simple as we'd like it to be, but one of those groups is the Polychaeta, and that means, Polychaeta means many bristles. So the common name for them is the bristleworms, and they have a fleshy bit on each segment with lots of bristles coming out. So the bobbit worm that I showed you is an example of that. One that you may be more familiar with is the lugworm or the ragworms that you find living in the sand on beaches. On the other side, we have the clitellata, and the clitellata refers to organisms that have a clitellum, which we commonly refer to as a saddle. So it's that fleshy band that you get on a worm, which we're all familiar with earthworms. So the clitellata divides into 2 main groups. You've got the Hibernea, which is the leeches, and that includes a few different groups. You've got the true leeches. You've also got some different things which specifically live in crayfish. Yeah, and they can be parasitic or they can be predatory. So some of them eat organisms whole, some of them will feed on blood. Then you've got the Oligochaeta, which is the main, the most diverse and the most well-studied part of the annelids. That includes lots of different groups across marine, terrestrial, and freshwater environments, although most of them are in either freshwater or marine environments, with really just a couple, including those potworms that I showed you earlier, that you find in terrestrial groups. And the one that we're thinking about today is the Crassiclitellata, where we've got over 5,000 species. So we can see the main diversity within the group is in there. Over 5,000 described species belonging to over 20 families, with 3 families found in the British Isles, and that is the true earthworms. So this is where earthworms fit in the animal kingdom, within the Annelida phylum. Right, okay, question for you all now. Is this earthworm an adult, true or false? So I'll give you a little bit of time to answer that. you can tell from the picture whether it's an adult or not. Right, okay. Just going to give you a couple more seconds. If you haven't got your answer, get it in quick. Is this earthworm, this earthworm is an adult? True or false? Right, okay. Right, let's share the results. So 81% of you have went with true, 19% of you have went with false. The majority are right. This is an adult. And the reason we can tell is because you've got this fleshy band here, this saddle. That is the feature that tells us it is an adult. So earthworms don't have a lot of features for us to look at, which is why we have to identify them using a microscope. So it's not possible to identify earthworms, unfortunately, using colour and size and things like that. In most countries, you actually would have to dissect an earthworm to be able to identify it. Sorry, just bear with me one sec. I've just noticed something. There we go. I just noticed somebody's accidentally annotated on the yeah, I can't get rid of that. Bear with me one sec. There we go. Yeah, so they don't have many features. They do have a head, they do have a tail. Their left-hand side and their right-hand side are symmetrical, just like us. So whatever you get on the left-hand side, you'll get on the right-hand side. But they do have a front end and a back end, and they do have a top and a bottom. So they're not symmetrical all the way around. And if you flip an earthworm upside down, if an earthworm's got a saddle, quite often its saddle won't be as defined underneath, and you can still see the segmentation quite clearly. So another quick question for the chat: is this earthworm male or female? So same earthworm as before. Is it male or female? Let's see who gets this right first. Anybody? Yeah, Alicia was first, straight in there with both. Earthworms are what we call simultaneous hermaphrodites, which means that they are both male and female, and when they mate with another earthworm, they play the role of male and female while mating. So they have both parts, and when mating, they use both. They use everything. Everybody gets to be the male and the female. So there's no he or she when it comes to earthworms. The correct pronouns are they, them. So, life cycle of an earthworm. Every earthworm will start off its life as a cocoon. So earthworm cocoons are these small little egg casings that you'll find in the soil for some of the bigger species. And inside here, you'll usually have a single egg. It depends on the species, but usually in the UK, you'll have a single egg that is fertilized, that will hatch, that will develop inside the egg casing. So the cocoons are quite leathery to touch. They're a little bit squishy. If you ever find them, don't squish them too hard because you'll pop them. But yeah, you can tell that that they've got liquid inside. And they provide a safe environment for the young earthworm to develop. Once the earthworm has reached a certain level, it will hatch. I get asked a lot of questions when I mention earthworm cocoons. So here's a quick slide to go through some of the facts and figures. How many fertilized eggs are in each cocoon? It can be anywhere from 1 to 20, depending on the species. But most British species, it will be 1. So most British species belong to the family Lumbricidae, and they tend to be a single fertilized egg within 1 cocoon. How many cocoons will an earthworm produce? It can be anywhere between 3 to 80. Again, depends on different things. How long do earthworms take to hatch? Anywhere from 3 weeks to 5 months. And what factors may play a role in all of the former questions? So species is important. I quite often get asked generic questions about earthworms, and I will sometimes reply with, the same question, but replace earthworm with the word mammal. And people realize then that actually they're asking me a very specific question about a group of different organisms that can be quite variable. But in addition to species, also the nutrition and health of the parent can also impact on whether these conditions, so these cocoon variables. And finally, environmental conditions. So earthworms may see out difficult periods of drought, what in the cocoon stage, for example. So yeah, lots of different things can impact this, and there's a lot we don't know. So for a lot of species, we don't have this information. A lot of the studies that have been done are all on the same species. So yeah, there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge as well. So got the earthworm cocoon, we know it's going to hatch. Out of there comes a hatchling. The juvenile earthworm will look very similar to how the adult will, but it just won't have that saddle. It'll already have the right number of segments as it would have an adult, and it just gets bigger and reaches the color that it reaches an adult. Once it's an adult and it wants to mate with another earthworm, what they will do is they'll line up in opposite directions alongside each other, and they'll use a feature called the tubercular pubitatis, or TP, to kind of grip each other. So on these ones, the TP on this earthworm here will be on the saddle, and same on here, and they're gripping each other with the saddle. They'll also produce some slime to encase them, so that they're protected from, so that their sperm is protected when they release it. Because when earthworms are mating, they release their sperm externally. So they have a feature around here called the male pole, where they'll release a sperm, and it travels within this slime tube to a pouch that the other earthworm will store it. So when they're mating, they're basically both giving each other sperm, so they're swapping sperm. And the egg fertilization happens at a later date. And what will happen is the saddle, they love slime, so the saddle will form what we call a mucus sheath. So it will release this mucus, and this mucus sheath will travel down the earthworm from the saddle towards the head. Along the way, it will pick up one of its own eggs, and it will pick up the sperm that's been stored from mating with another earthworm. And then that will fertilize the egg inside the cocoon. So the reason the cocoons are quite often this lemon shape is because it's when the mucus sheath comes off the end of the earthworm, it has to pinch on both sides to encase the egg and make sure the egg remains safe. So that, in a nutshell, is the life cycle of an earthworm. If you want a much weirder description, there's a YouTube video with Isabella Rossellini dressed up in an earthworm costume, acting it all out. So yeah, if you Google Isabella Rossellini and earthworm mating, you'll find that. There's a couple of inaccuracies in it, but it's quite an entertaining, if not odd, little educational video. Right, okay, I think it's time for me to have a voice break and to let you guys have another question. So I'm going to launch, oh no, I'm going to launch a poll, and I would like to know, earthworms will drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding, true or false? So think about this. Have you seen earthworms in a puddle? Yeah. Think about maybe as well, evolutionarily, think about the things that they're related to. Can they survive in aquatic environments? Because maybe there might be some similarities there. Okay, last chance to answer. All right, okay. So we're less sure on this one. We've got 64% going for true and 36% going for false. Well, it's actually false. So well done to the 36%. Earthworms will not drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding because earthworms actually require a moisture layer to breathe. They don't have lungs like us, they breathe through their skin. So they need it to be moist, and they're actually quite well adapted to breathing in even in aquatic environments. So in a puddle, they can breathe fine. Most of their relatives live in aquatic or marine environments and breathe through their skin. And we do have a lot of specific specialist earthworms species that really like really wet habitats. However, some of you will be thinking, what's he on about? I've seen earthworms floating around in a puddle, worse for wear, looking dead. That's true. You do get them dying in puddles. And the reason is earthworms can breathe in water, but if all the oxygen is taken out of the water, they'll actually suffocate. So again, I went for a little bit of a trick question. Earthworms won't drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding because they can breathe. But once that situation gets completely anaerobic, deoxygenated, then they will suffocate. And I found a few recently in some temporary pools that were definitely not still alive. And I think the water smelt a little bit. So I think that all the oxygen had been used up. Right, okay, so a little bit about earthworm anatomy. Most of the important stuff is in the head end. And so they do have they take food in through a mouth essentially. In the head end, they do have a muscular area at the top, which they use to pull in food. And within that, you've got a pinhead-sized brain. So they do have a nervous system of sorts. It's not quite as complex as ours, but yeah, earthworms do have a tiny little brain. They're also really different to a lot of other invertebrate groups in that they're similar to us with their blood. So earthworms do actually have red blood like us, and that's because they've got hemoglobin in their blood. So they take oxygen into their blood in a very similar way to we do. Now, they don't have hearts to pump that round like we do, but they have these thickened blood vessels which come in pairs called pseudo-hearts. And most British earthworm species will have 5 pairs of them, not 3 like in the diagram. Most will have 5. They also eat quite tough food. Eating leaves and soil and things like that can be quite difficult to grind up. They obviously don't have any teeth. So they have a system very similar to birds. So birds, likewise, they don't have teeth to grind up their food. So they have what we call a crop and a gizzard. And the gizzard is this really tough muscular area that is used to grind up the food. And earthworms will quite often eat quite tough materials like some little rocks and things like that to help with that process of grinding up their food. Right, okay, so I've given you a bit of a clue to this with the last slide. If you cut an earthworm in half, you will get 2 living earthworms. Is that, stop sharing, Keiron, is that true or false? Polls should be appearing again. Answers, please. Do you think if you cut an earthworm in half, you get 2 living worms? All right, I'm going to give you a couple more seconds. You're getting faster with these polls. All right, okay. This is quite different to what I normally get when I ask this question. 94% have went for false and 6% have went for true. Well, the answer is theoretically, you actually, in some cases you could, but it's highly unlikely. The reality is, although some earthworms have amazing regenerative powers and are able to regrow segments that they've lost, most of the important stuff is at the head end. So in reality, what I would say is, firstly, some earthworm species do not have good regenerative powers. So even if they lose a bit of their tail, they will struggle to grow that back. So damage affects them quite severely. Other species can deal with it much better. if you tend to cut them between the head and the saddle, you're probably going to end up with one dead worm in two parts. If it gets cut after the saddle, if it's one of the species that is better at regenerating segments, then it may regrow its tail. And it's quite interesting the way they do this, because I've seen it in specimens that I've found when I've been out looking for earthworms. And they grow back the tail with all of the segments, but it's thinner, like you can see here, and sometimes it's really, really pale. So it grows back the same number of segments that they lost, but it grows back thinner and really pale, and then it starts to get fatter again until it's the same size as the rest of the worm, and it gradually gets the color back as well. So it's just interesting how I would imagine that they grow it back segment by segment, but it's not like that at all. And some earthworms will even choose to lose a tail, maybe not consciously, but their body reaction is to drop their tail, so they cast it off. This process is called autotomy, and it's a predator defense, essentially. So they'll do it when they feel under threat. Another behavior that's quite interesting, you may have sometimes seen them wrapped up in a knot like this. When earthworms are knotted up like this, it's because what they're doing is they're hibernating or estivating. So estivating is like hibernation, but in drought conditions, whereas hibernation is specifically in winter, in cold conditions. So when the conditions are not great for earthworms, they might go into a state of hibernation, and they knock themselves up in a ball to do that. And they, again, as with everything else, they release some special type of mucus that protects them, and they'll quite often burrow down deeper to do that as well. But yeah, so if you ever see them like this, don't unknot them. You're not helping them out. Right, okay. So we now know a little bit about earthworms and their biology. So what do we know about earthworms on a global scale? So earthworms, despite being widely recognized as really important, are still really understudied. And this is from a scientific paper that looks at which countries, which territories have been checklisted in what's called a COE study. And we can see that there are large areas of the globe that are still really, we're really devoid of information. So large parts of Africa, and the Middle East. Also, there's large parts of South America that we know very little about their earthworms as well. And there are still some quite amazing things to find. So the picture here, the one on the left, is a aerial shot. I think the aerial shot is actually from Delphine Renard, so we'll add that credit in verbally as well. And on the right, you've got some mounds. So they're the same habitat, but one's from above and one's looking at ground level. And those big mounds, which can be several meters across, are actually giant earthworm poos, and we only found that out relatively recently. So I believe it covers, it's a wetland area in I think it's Colombia and Venezuela. It's in South America. It's huge. It's bigger than Wales, and this whole environment is created by giant earthworms that create these giant mounds through their earthworm poop, and it creates the whole habitat. So we only found out that it was definitely earthworms that created this habitat. Some people thought it was possibly man-made, or man-made as in cultivated. But yeah, fairly recently proven to be earthworms. And you get them in all sorts of different habitats. So here's some earthworm researchers looking for earthworms in, I believe it's Nicaragua. And they're in the rainforest, but they're not looking at the ground. There's a guy in the tree there. What they're actually looking for are bromeliads in the canopy. And once you break apart these bromeliads, there's these little accumulations of humus, organic material. You'll find earthworms, and some of those might even be blue earthworms. So Eutrogaster azul was described within the last 15 years and it's a blue earthworm from bromeliads in the rainforest. And they do come in all sorts of great colours. This is the fried eggs worm from the Philippines, which you find freely living on the forest floor. Things don't seem to touch it, probably because it looks like it might be quite toxic. The biggest earthworm in the world, don't ask me how long it is, because every different thing I read says something different. So it's somewhere between 2 and 3 meters. And the difficulty in measuring that might be because of the very nature of earthworms with their contracting and extending. It makes it quite hard to measure. But I've heard anything between 2 and 3 meters. They certainly get to at least 2 meters. So that's a giant gypsum earthworm that you'll find in the soils in I can't remember if it's southern Australia, Western Australia, or Victoria, but it's somewhere in Australia. And that might not even be the biggest in the world. There are earthworm casts that have been found in the Brazilian rainforest. Look at the size of them there next to that hand, where we've never found the species that's creating these. So there are potentially some fairly large earthworms that still remain undiscovered today. Right. How many species of earthworm occur in natural environments in the British Isles? So that's Britain and Ireland. So the UK and Ireland. Drop your answer in the chat. Let's have a look. 3. It's a few more than 3, Jenny. Nice try. 6. 30. 31. There we go. N got it right. 31 is right. We've got 31 different species in the UK and Ireland. And we've known for a long time that earthworms are very important. The first real earthworm researcher in the UK was a man you may have heard of, Charles Darwin. Now, most people know of him for his other book, but his biggest selling book in his lifetime, which was his last book and was one of his life works, was The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. And it's a fantastic read. I highly recommend it. And within it, Darwin says that worms have played a more important part in the history of the world than most persons would at first suppose. So we all know the earthworms are important for the soil. What a lot of people don't realize is, though, that the different types of earthworms do different things. So we have different types of earthworms that live at different levels within the soil. We've got what we call epigeic earthworms living on the surface. Think of like epidermis, your skin, to the surface. Then we've got endogeic earthworms. So endo means within. Think of endoscopy. Within, and they live in the top layers of the soil. They rarely come to the surface. And then we've got the anesic earthworms, which comes from a French word, and this is the deep burrowing earthworms. The deep burrowing earthworms live in vertical permanent burrows, and they will live in the deep soils, but also they'll come up at night. So they really are found at all levels, and they can grow quite big. So in the UK, we can get up to 40 centimeters with our biggest species. So anesic earthworms, they're big, they're quite often quite pigmented, so they look really dark brown, red, purpley colours. They feed on soil and leaves. They tend to be darker towards the head end rather than the tail end. One thing that helps you tell them from the others as well, if you poke their tail, if you ever have one in your hand, they'll flatten their tail. And they do that normally in nature to anchor themselves in their burrow. Our biggest species, Lumbricus terrestris, a lobworm, will form middens. It will block up the burrow, it's the entrance to its burrows, and you can see one here. They'll use their poo and soil, but they'll also use stones and twigs and leaves and anything lying around. So we can see another one there from the side, and then there's 2 there. Usually earthworm middens will be about the right size apart for mating with your neighbour. And what they'll do is they'll come out at night and they'll keep their tail anchored into their burrow so that if something comes along that might eat them, they can retreat very quickly. So that's Lumbricus terrestris, a common earthworm, the lobworm, but there are other anesic species that will, and you'll see their big earthworm casts sometimes on the surface as well. So we can see one here. So if you've got lots of these in your garden, that means your soils are really good. So anesic earthworms play a role in all sorts of different soil processes. They're really, really important for soil pore creation, though. So one of the things that they do really, really well is their deep vertical burrows allow air and water to get into the soil. So, and they're also decomposing leaves and soil as well, because they're eating both of those. So the endogeic earthworms, they were the ones living in the top layers of the soil, rarely come to the surface. If you ever find an earthworm that looks sickly in colour, that's an endogeic earthworm. They can be all sorts of different colours: blue, grey, brown, pink, green, yeah, all sorts, yellow, and sometimes a mixture of those different colours. They can be kind of any size. So whereas the anesic earthworms are quite big, these ones can be anything from quite big to relatively small. And when we look at what they do, they contribute to different soil processes as well. But these ones are really important for soil aggregate formation. So because they're eating the soil, they're just munching the soil and then pooing it out inside within the soil, they're helping create a structure to the soil. So they help with what we call soil aggregate formation, which is soil particles, where you've got little tiny molecules of soil all stuck together. So without that kind of structure, everything will be really, really sandy. So yeah, they're really, really important for that. Then we have the epigeic earthworms, and the epigeic earthworms are really varied in what they do. These are the surface-dwelling earthworms that are found much less often in the soil, but we will get different types of epigeic earthworm in different habitats. So you get them in leaf litter, you get them in dung, you get them in compost bins, you'll get them in dead wood, you'll get them under moss, you'll get them in all sorts of habitats, and what they're usually doing is feeding on organic material, not necessarily soil. So they might be feeding on animal poo, they might be feeding on decaying leaves, they might be feeding on your garden and kitchen waste. So they're really, really good, unsurprisingly. That's one in Deadwood. They're really, really good, unsurprisingly, for decomposition. So if it wasn't for these type of earthworms, we might be surrounded by a lot more of our, and when I say our, I mean animal and plant waste. So yeah, really important for decomposition. But where earthworms become really important, if we combine all three of those groups together, we can see that they're really important to different degrees for all of these different soil processes. So decomposition, nutrient cycling. So nutrient cycling is converting nutrients into a form that can be taken up by plants, fixing carbon, soil pore creation, soil aggregate formation. And that provides what we call ecosystem services. So these are the things that we rely on and other organisms rely on. So they help with recycling waste and detoxifying the soil. Like I said, they help with carbon and nutrient regulation. They help water flow regulation, so they help with drainage, so they help with flooding, and they help maintain the soil structure that we need to grow the crops that we need to survive. And on top of all of that, there's a lot of biomass production. So the earthworms account for a lot of things in the soil. So speaking of earthworms as biomass, true or false? Do you, oh, I can't find the poll. Where's the poll on? True or false? Do earthworms dance around on the ground and charm earthworms out of it? Or is that a myth? So, yeah, birds charm earthworms out of the ground by dancing and hopping on the ground. Is that true or false? Just give you a couple more seconds. All right, okay, so 86% of you went for true, 14% for false. The majority are right. Yes, earthworm. We must have all seen the blackbirds, etc., dancing around. Seagulls do it as well, hopping around. And what we think they're doing is imitating rain. So some earthworms will come to the surface when it's been raining, possibly to disperse because it's easier for them and safer for them to travel along the ground once it's been raining. But that's the thinking behind it. But it brings up the point of another reason why earthworms are really important. So it's not just for the soil. Earthworms are a key food for many species. So I've picked out some of the cuddly, lovely things that people get excited about. There's a blackbird there, but it could be any garden bird. Even birds of prey will feed on earthworms. My last flat that I lived in, there was a little robin that would always fly right up to me on the fence with a worm in his mouth. It's like he was taunting me. Yeah, lots of garden birds. Earthworms are a really important part of their diet. Same with reptiles and amphibians. Earthworms will play an important part of their diet. And some of our most beloved garden mammals. So the badger, there's a study that looked at badger poo and looked at the little bristles that you get in badger poo. And they're a certain size, they belong to the biggest species. And they found that badgers were almost exclusively, if not exclusively, feeding on Lumbricus terrestris, the lobworm. So that's a really important food source for that. Hedgehogs, they provide a really, really good food source for hedgehogs. And of course, moles, where moles would struggle without earthworms, that's for sure. Invertebrates will eat earthworms as well, so they're really important for other invertebrates, including other annelids. So some leeches will feed on earthworms. But we have other invertebrates that are not from the UK that have been introduced into the UK that feed on our earthworms. And this is a little bit of a concern for us. So the New Zealand flatworm is obviously from New Zealand, and it was introduced probably through pot plants, through moving soil around in plants into the UK in the 1960s. It does seem to be spreading. We're not sure yet if it's going to have a significant impact on our earthworm populations, but the anecdotal evidence, the anecdotal reports I get from people in Scotland where it's pretty prevalent are that they find lots of this under stones and none of the big earthworms anymore. So I think it's something that we need to keep an eye on. And it's not the only one. The Australian flatworm is a problem in the southwest, and it possibly feeds, I think it feeds on different types of earthworm to the New Zealand flatworm. There isn't really an overlap in their distributions yet. They have different requirements, environmental requirements, but if you've got a back garden that's shaded and a front garden that gets lots of sun, you might have conditions for both. And I have heard of that happening in some parts of the UK. And there are more flatworms that might be a threat to our native earthworms that might be coming soon. So the Obama flatworm from Brazil is getting reported more and more from pot plants, and we think this is something that could potentially cause problems for our earthworms. The biggest threat, though, is the New Guinea flatworm, which is a real problem on the continent. We haven't got it that I'm aware of yet, but it's one of the non-native invasive species that the UK government is on the lookout for, because it's something that we think will be coming soon, and when it does, it could have quite a significant impact on our earthworm species. So if you do find any flatworms on pot plants that you've bought, there's a website, a web page on the Bug Life website called Potwatch, where you can enter your sightings there. Please do add a photo as well, because that helps verify the record. And some of these flatworms can be quite tricky to ID. If you can add something like a pound coin or something to the photo to give perspective as well, that's really, really useful. Right, okay, so I just want to end the talk pretty much with some positive news about some positive ideas about what you can do for earthworms. So the question I get asked a lot is, what can I do in my garden to help earthworms? First of all, you can compost. So if you're composting, you'll attract certain species that it would be really difficult to get in a garden habitat without. So composting, you don't even need to introduce the earthworms, they'll find their way there. Leaf litter. So we've heard about earthworms that feed on leaf litter, and we've heard about earthworms that live in the leaf litter. If you're tidying up your leaves, then the earthworms have got nothing. Some species have got nothing to eat and nothing to live in. So leaving leaves on the ground not only will save you back, but it will also provide a habitat, not just for earthworms, but many other invertebrates as well. If you want to keep your garden really tidy, that's understandable. But if you mulch your borders, something like that, then that habitat at least is still somewhere in the garden for them. Deadwood. Deadwood is like the #1 thing. Again, not just for earthworms, for many things. It provides a home to so many different things. If you have deadwood in your garden, you can get earthworms living within it, under the bark, or under the deadwood. If you want to see as many different types of earthworm as possible, the best thing is to have some old logs in there. And when you turn them over, you'll quite often find all 3 of those groups of earthworms that I mentioned resting underneath. Not everybody has a garden where they can have they've got lots of space. Some people live in urban areas where they've got a tiny little patch of concrete, but you can still add variety there by having lots of plant pots and things like that. That will give them they can live within the soil in the plant pot, they can hide underneath it. If you've got a plant pot and a patio area that gets wet regularly, you'll find that when you look under the wet plant pot, wet ground with plant pots, there'll be earthworms there. So yeah, adding lots of microhabitats is really how you make it better for earthworm diversity. Trees. So we get some earthworm species that actually live not just under trees, but some of them live within trees. So there are composting epigeic species, the same ones that you might find in your compost bin, you might find in rot holes and things like that in trees. And there's one species in particular that seems to really like climbing up to those rot holes that you get in trees as well. Trees will also shade part of the ground, so you've got variety in the environmental conditions in the ground. They'll drop leaves, which is great as well. Yeah, trees and earthworms go hand in hand. So if you've got space for a nice big oak tree or some other native species of tree, that's really, really, really useful. Adding structure to your garden is great as well. So you'll get some earthworms that particularly like living under hedgerows and that kind of environment. So just adding different layers to your garden is really good. Having a no-dig policy can be really good as well. There's a course I do for the Field Studies Council where people submit evidence of earthworms as part of one of the assignments. And there's a couple of people where they've submitted evidence of earthworm casts and the ground is covered, absolutely covered. And in those cases, it's usually an area where they've never dug or they purposefully don't dig. So yeah, not disturbing the earthworms allows them to thrive. Likewise, no chemicals. Earthworms and chemicals don't go very well together. Even if it doesn't kill them, it might accumulate within their body, and when they're eaten by all those things that eat them, they end up poisoning them. And alongside that, I'd say no plastic lawns. That can poison it can pollute the soil underneath, so that can cause harm as well. Water, if you've got a wet bog area or a pond, you're going to be more likely to get the wet soil specialists that I mentioned earlier. And finally, grass clippings. So if you leave some grass clippings there, earthworms will deal with it. And some earthworms really like that really nitrogen-rich type of soil, and they'll get rid of it. They'll break it down for you. So how are earthworms doing? We don't really know. We're still finding out some of the basic stuff. I'm working with a researcher called Dr. Frank Ashwood from Forest Research, where we're looking at, from earthworm records that have been sent in by volunteer biological recorders, we're looking at the relationship between, and we're looking at how biased the data we have is in research versus the stuff that comes in from biological recorders. And you can see here, in a nutshell, basically, the reason that the image, the graph thing on the left is more colourful is because there's a wider variety of microhabitats and habitats surveyed by volunteer recorders. There's a lot of the research that's been done is all agriculture or woodland, and using specific methods like digging soil pits and looking in the soil, which means that a lot of the information we have on those epigeic earthworms and some of the rare species is really, really limited. I'm also working with Emma Sherlock, who is the Natural History Museum's Earthworm curator. She's a fantastic, inspiring individual, and the person that got me into earthworms. And I'm working with her. So I told you about those 3 groups, but really it's a triangular scale. And we're working to get definitive categories for all of the British and Irish species. So that's something that we're working on using the earthworm data that we've been gathering as well. And very shortly, very soon, within the next few months, hopefully, there'll be a UK Provisional Conservation Status Assessment Report getting published, which is something I've been working on for Natural England. And it uses the same categories as IUCN red listing. So when we say that something is extinct or endangered or vulnerable, there's some very strict statistical work that's gone on. A provisional assessment is kind of using the same categories, but without the same statistical rigor, because we don't have the data for earthworms. So I'm going through what we do have and giving my best guess based on what we've got. And sometimes I don't mind admitting it really is a best guess, because we're so limited in the data that we've got. Just a quick plug as well, there are a couple more things coming up. So if you want to know more about some of the research that I've just been talking about and the recording scheme, there is a blog on my website, which I'll drop this link in the chat after we've finished, where you can catch up with previous talk I did on that. And I'll be doing a talk specifically about gardening for earthworms and going into more detail, I think, yeah, in October. And that's free, so you can book on that for free. So, and then the final thing I just wanted to say is there's a free newsletter for anybody interested in learning more. So I'm gonna be quiet now. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I'm sorry, I went on a bit longer than I was supposed to.